Hey everybody, welcome to this week's Q&As. It's Thursday morning, so hopefully everybody had enough time to get their questions in. So let's jump in and see what we got. Starting us out over on Floatplane, Shorzor wanted to chime in on the conversation of HDMI switches and mentioned decommissioned enterprise equipment, which is excellent. I mean, that's essentially all of the analog Extron stuff that we have was thousands and thousands of dollars when it was new, and then no one could really use it anymore, so we all get it at fractions of the price, and most of it still works great. And all of that still applies to HDMI stuff, because if you have a lot of retro-related things, or even just consoles up until the latest gen, you don't really need more than HDMI 1.4. So you could have a formerly multi-$1,000 decommissioned matrix switch that could do things like EDIT emulation and control via CEC, plus other automation built in via RS-232 if anybody's into home automation and knows how to write those protocols. And so, I mean, that's a really great idea. And you could get something like the like Shorzor linked to the newer Ori 4x4 switches, which are still hundreds of dollars and doesn't have all of the features that I would want, but it's still a great conversation to have. And I know I've mentioned, using older Extron HDMI switches in the past, but I think as our HDMI needs grow in retro, that's kind of more and more relevant to what we're talking about. So if anybody else has any suggestions like that, let me know, especially if there's lots of in, lots of out scenarios, something that can go up to 4K 60, let's just say, and have 10 in, 5 out. I would love to see stuff like that. And, if it's used and it dies in a year or two, but I only get it for a fraction of the price, I personally would be totally okay with that. And I assume a lot of people in retro would too, because we're used to dealing with decades old equipment where there's no guarantee how long it could last. So I don't know. That was a good suggestion. Let me know if anybody else has any models or anything to look out for. One more from Shorzor. They have a niche, perhaps stupid idea. Look, it can't be any more niche or stupid than a lot of the ideas I have, so we're definitely going to keep going with this. They have a 31 kilohertz Luva CRT they've been talking about over the last little while, and they thought it could be fun looking into odd resolutions as long as they are 31 kilohertz. They were thinking that if a scaler was able to output at 480i 120, then downscaling Switch 2 and other high refresh rate consoles could be a fun gimmick for this purpose, as the resolution is within 31 kilohertz. So taking something like 720p 120 Hz and scaling it down to 480i 120 would be fun to try. Do I know if any of the scalers currently available have such capabilities? I'm not sure. The Tink 4K Pro might. And while I think that's a very fun idea and certainly worth trying, just for the purposes of doing the experiment, you're still kind of losing half of the resolution there, because 120 hertz interlaced is basically the same as 60 hertz progressive. Just like when we're doing those VHS stuff, it's recorded at 480p 2997, which is actually an interlaced version of 60 frames per second, because each are weaved together. So it would be a fun thing to try if you had all the equipment, just to see if it would work and just to see what it would look like, but you're not really going to be gaining anything from it. But that was not a stupid idea, because very often ideas like this will trigger other ideas in people's brains. Like, well, that's not going to work, but what if we do this and, add something else to it? So cool, keep them coming. And if anybody wants to try it, see if it works, see what it looks like. Maybe it's just a fun thing to just say, hey, I tried this and it was pretty neat, or maybe I'm missing something. I don't know. It's very early in the morning right now. So chime in if anybody has any thoughts on that, but I thought that was a fun idea. Now moving over to Patreon, Dustin Madison wants to know what my personal way of having my systems would be set up video-wise. Which ones would I prefer to be stock, modded for either RGB or HDMI, ODE or not, overclock, custom firmware, etc. And my answer to that is constantly changing. So my answer to you, Dustin, is going to be a complete and total cop-out. I'm sorry, but it's just the truth, in that all the time I'm learning about new mods and trying different things, and very often I'll get excited about something and use that for a while, and then my opinion will change either after something else comes out, or as the new wears off, or whatever else. But one thing that has been pretty consistent with me over the years is that for my absolute favorite consoles, or I guess if I had the budget to have multiples of all the consoles, I would always want one that's fully refurbished and 100% stock. So replace all of the capacitors, clean up the motherboard, see if there's any components that need maintenance done to them, but then don't add any mods, so I always have an original experience to go back to. And why those aren't the consoles I play the most, those are always the consoles that have been important to me to own. So like I have a completely unmodded NES, only outputs composite in RF, but fully recapped, the case is in beautiful condition. And same thing with the Japanese MK2000, vertical jail bars and all. I love that thing. It's got the built-in 3D glasses adapter. So that's just something that's always important to me is my absolute favorite consoles. I want completely stock versions. And if I had the budget, I would also then do mods to a second one out of all of them and kind of go from there. And in fact, if there were clear cases available, I would do it that way. I would keep a completely stock original and then get one of those awesome Retro Gamer Store clear shells and do all the crazy mods to the other one. And the modded ones would probably be the ones that I played most often, but I always would want an original one too, just for my favorites, or once again, if it wasn't a budget issue, then I would just have one of each for every console. But yeah, that's the only opinion that hasn't really changed since I started RetroRGB, is the favorite stuff. I'm always excited for the mods, but I also just want an original to go back to. And it's also something I rely on for RetroRGB as well, because every time I show a new mod, I have to compare it to what it used to be like. So it's not just that it's special to me, it's what I would need to do my job. So yeah, probably not the answer you were looking for, but it is the truth. Next up, Pippin wants to talk about the issue with the LG OLEDs that I've tested, where you get more latency if you switch it to 4:3 mode. The video I did about the C4 OLED showed that happened, and Mark from My Life in Gaming did a video on the C2 that had the same problem. So why does it happen? And is it just LG TVs? Is it just OLEDs? Is it LCDs as well? And I'll answer the second one first, because the easy answer is I have no idea. I would have to go back and retest every TV in Best Buy or something, which would always be kind of fun, to be honest, but I don't have the means to do that. So anybody with a lag testing device would have to go in and try that. You could just switch the TV to 4:3 mode. You don't need to send it a 4:3 resolution in order to test this problem. So any lag testing device should work for that, and just kind of see what happens. Now, why it happens, I can only speculate. So every word out of my mouth will probably be total BS, but it is a guess based on experience, and that they just don't think about video games. And it's always been that way with TV manufacturers. They just don't care about analog video games. And don't forget, this is including back in the mid-2000s, where Sony's PS2 was the best-selling console, I think, of all time, or it certainly accounted for a giant source of Sony's revenue. And even Sony TVs had issues with video games and analog signals or lower resolution signals like that. So I just think it's always ignored by TV manufacturers. And I think more specifically, the companies who make the chips for TV manufacturers just don't think of older video games. They only think of older video content, which is very common, especially for anybody that still is out there using a cable box. It's probably mostly still, terrible resolutions and compression. And also, they're concentrating on modern gaming. So my guess, 100% guess, is that these TVs are tuned so that when it gets a 4:3 signal, it buffers a frame of the image so that it could do more processing to make your older content, like TVs and stuff, TV shows, look less crappy on the OLEDs. So that's only a guess. I have no idea, but it makes sense based on the history of how TV manufacturers treated video games. And from a video point of view, that actually makes sense. Like, okay, we have older, it's 4:3, so it must be older. I guess they didn't watch the Snyder Cut. And then you go in and you flip it on, so it buffers the image. That allows for more processing to be done, so your old crappy looking TV shows on your old cable box might look fine. I get that, but they did completely ignore old video games. And that's why products like the RetroTinks and the OSSCs have to exist, because we have to compensate for what these TV manufacturers aren't doing. Which is kind of funny, because if TV manufacturers had put as much effort into video games as they did TV since back in the day, we probably would never need anything like a RetroTink. Or it would just be an analog to digital converter that you could then send HDMI to your TV. So yeah, that's my guess, just based on seeing what TV manufacturers have done over the years. But if anybody out there wants to test their other brand TVs to see if there's more lag in 4:3 mode, please let us know in the comments. I'd be very curious just to see. Next up, Brian Carbone says, when playing all of our shared favorite game, the 240p test suite, which console do I prefer when calibrating a CRT? They ask because of the two they've spent the most time with, SNES and Dreamcast, they appear to have a fairly different color output while both are using high-quality SCART cables from retro gaming cables. They don't need anything that is reference test pattern generator quality, but they like to know which console with the 240p test suite available is best to bias their calibration to. They often play across many different consoles and would like to avoid recalibrating per console as much as possible. So my personal choice is to calibrate to my favorite console. So I would either do SNES or Genesis, probably SNES just because, Super Mario World, Super Metroid, those are all some of my favorite games of all time. But I think the answer to your question is stick with the Dreamcast. Now, it's been a long time since I asked Artemio this, almost a decade, I think, actually. But the last time I remember having this conversation, he said the Dreamcast because it would offer all of the output options that you would want, and it should be able to cover the extra color range and things like that. So that's my guess. If anybody out there has any updated info on this or want to confirm, I would be interested in anybody's opinion. But my gut's telling me, exactly like you explained, fully shielded cables, good setup, 480i or even 240p through the Dreamcast would probably be the best way to calibrate. And then you just have to kind of go back and double check that your other consoles look okay. I think the only issue you might have is just make sure that the geometry is the way you want it for the other consoles as well. And you might have to find a happy medium between them. But I think going with the Dreamcast is a good bet. But please correct me if I'm wrong. Next up, Space Farmer wants me to expand a bit on what the issue is with Extron Crosspoints and sync. There's two issues, in and out. On the input side, the sync lines, the H and V, horizontal and vertical sync, can only accept pure sync. So for an RGB-S signal, that would be C-sync, so not composite video as sync and not Luma as sync. And in the case of a VGA signal, RGB HV, you'd have to have both horizontal and vertical pure sync, which I don't think that's ever not the issue with VGA, but that's the problem on the input side. So for most consoles, you would just get sync on C-sync cables. You can get some made with BNC outputs. Should not be an issue for anything other than PlayStation 1 and 2. And for PS2, you could obviously just go component if you would prefer to do that anyway. Now, on the output side of things, whatever signals that you put into it, the sync is then processed and set at a industry standard level, which for non-SCART equipment makes perfect sense. But the SCART standard requires lower voltage than what the standard RGBS output would be. So when I say standard, I'm talking about things like projectors in boardrooms, rack-mounted equipment, lots of corporate or enterprise level stuff. That's where you would normally see BNC connectors and stuff like that. So that's where it adhered to those industry standards. So if you send it directly to SCART equipment, you could damage or just totally kill the SCART equipment, which is why you need a resistor on just the sync line to drop the voltage down. I think there are some Crosspoints that let you change the sync settings, but I just think it's safe to have it with it in, because the worst possible thing that could happen if you have like a BNC to SCART cable with a resistor on the sync line and you don't need it, it doesn't sync. So you go, okay, I don't need it. And you just take it out. Where the opposite, you don't want it. You don't want to kill your console by accidentally sending too much. So hopefully that kind of puts it into perspective. It's a little weird to kind of figure out what analog video is. And it's a lot harder than you would expect to really grasp it all. And a somewhat related question, can you connect a Mr. Analog board to a Crosspoint with a basic straight monoprice VGA cable, VGA to BNC cable, and then use it to output RGB or component? Yes, because that outputs the correct sync and voltage on sync line, so you don't need to worry about that at all. And for component video, you're only using the RGB lines, the RGB inputs of the Crosspoint can accept component, RGB, composite, or S-video all right through there. So yeah, that would work totally fine, and you don't have to worry about anything else. So just monoprice, the VGA to BNC, and you're probably only going to find VGA to 5 BNC, so just leave off the last one so you don't even have to worry about it. You just have the horizontal sync connected and just leave the vertical sync dangling. I personally wouldn't even plug it into the Crosspoint just in case the Mister's sending extra data. But I don't think it would hurt it if you would, to be honest. So if you got OCD and you don't want a cable dangling, you could do it that way. But yeah, that should be fine. And then just make sure that your Mister is set accordingly. So you'd want it set to output RGBS, not RGB HV. So Yeah, good questions. The stuff's super confusing, but hopefully I could put it into perspective. Next up, Josh Lopez is looking for an optical drive emulator for the Dreamcast that allows you to retain the original GDROM drive. Because, like most of us, Josh will probably be predominantly using the ODE, but still wants to retain the ability to use their original discs. And I believe there's one, and it's a complicated installation. I think you have to cut the case and run a cable out the back, and then you're running an ODE that's kind of hanging out the back of the Dreamcast, and you could still use the GD-ROM with it. A couple of friends of mine have made them over the years and said they work fine, but all other versions of ODEs out there, you have to remove the GD-ROM, and those are the ones that are mostly supported with a lot of the extra features on them. So I can't remember which one would work hanging out the back like that. I'm sure you could do some creative web searching and find it, but I've never personally used it, and I would have no advice on that other than if you really wanted to try it, let us know what your experience was. But also, stuff like that gets to be so complicated that you might really want to consider buying a second Dreamcast. Because if you want to put it into perspective, think about what it would cost to build all of that. What if you have to cut a case? Do you really want to cut your Dreamcast case? What would it cost to put it all in versus what would it cost to just buy a second Dreamcast and just, swap the caps and the power supplies so it lasts a long time, and there you go. And you remember it's the same set of cables. So if you're always using the one with the ODE, you could just swap the cables, unplug it, swap the new Dreamcast in. You just need a second console. And even, coming from that perspective, you might even be able to find Dreamcasts with dead drives in them and, beat up yellowed cases or something like that for a lot cheaper than a nice Dreamcast. So, while I would suggest looking into the other option just in case, just keep price in mind because it just might be easier for you overall to do it that way. And who knows, maybe you'll swing back to what I was talking about before, and maybe you'll have one Dreamcast with a really nice original case that's all recapped with the GD-ROM drive. Even keep the original fan, just clean it up and everything, maybe oil it up a little bit if you need to, and there you go. There's your original experience Dreamcast, and then you get another one with those beautiful Yowie clear shells or the different colored shells, and put an ODE in that one, and get a different power supply if you need to. If you're doing things like maybe one of them is a Japanese Dreamcast, I don't know, but that's just some perspective. But hopefully, at least point you in the right direction. Next up, Rent Optional wants to know if I have a recommendation for desoldering tweezers. They were looking at the Hakko 8804-2, and those are $195. I actually think they're $130. I'll leave a link to the Amazon ones that I found. But anyway, they'll plug into the 888DX soldering station that they already own. And they know I said good tweezers are very expensive, but being that their desoldering gun that they own is over $300, the $195 doesn't seem that expensive. They know everyone's financial tolerances are different, but they just want to confirm that the Hakko ones are good to use, mainly for recaps of PS1s and N64s. Short answer, I think yes, but let me just elaborate a little bit more. So first and foremost, you can't really go wrong with Hakko. There might be alternatives that are cheaper that work just as good, or you might more likely run into something that looks the same, but isn't at all. And that's probably the more common scenario, to be honest with you. Also, the link that I found is 130, so I'm not just pimping an affiliate link here. It is actually cheaper than the ones you were talking about. So in your scenario of you have the budget, you already own the 888DX soldering station, and you're just looking for a good tool to rely on, my gut is telling me absolutely yes. Just buy these, try them out. It should be as good as it gets. Everything has a learning curve, though. You're not going to just grab these and magically pop tweezers off, like you've been doing this for a decade. You're still going to have to kind of learn the proper techniques and stuff. But if you're going to go down the road of getting desoldering tweezers and you have the budget, getting good equipment is really important. And one thing I could tell you for absolute certainty is don't get the cheap junk, because it almost will make it worse in some scenarios. So my total guess here is that if you pick up this $130 one, you're going to absolutely love it, and it's going to be exactly what you're looking for. But if anybody has experience with alternatives, please let me know. I just think in the scenario of you already have the expensive soldering station, you already invested in a really good desoldering gun, it just makes so much sense to me that you would want to have this so that you could just, add this to your toolbox and have something that you could rely on for this stuff. Well, that's it for this week. As always, ask any question you would like wherever it is that you post. Just please do so in the latest Q&A post, because the way the services work, I can't really figure out what's a new question on an old post. Plus, as you saw here today, I like just scrolling through them and answering as if we were hanging out somewhere like an expo or something, just making this a laid back, hopefully fun experience. But anyway, as always, thank you for anybody who supports in absolutely any way, because it really is you who's keeping this stuff going. So thanks again, and I'll see you next week.